At UFC 279, Khamzat Chimaev continued his unbeaten run in the UFC as he simply dismantled Kevin Holland inside the very first round of their catchweight bout. Now, obviously, there have been a lot of controversies regarding Chimaev's win over Holland, mostly due to him missing weight by 7.5 pounds for his originally scheduled welterweight bout against Nate Diaz. But praise to Kevin Holland as well for agreeing to fight someone like Khamzat on a day's notice and technically giving us a big fight for the UFC 279 pay-per-view and for technically keeping a superstar like Khamzat Chimaev on this card. The other controversy is that Chimaev apparently tried to fake glove with Holland in the opening seconds of the fight, which led to him shooting for the takedown and eventually dominating Holland on the mat, which got him the win. But here's the thing. I don't really want to go into details about the controversies, but Chimaev and Holland did touch gloves before this fight started. So maybe his intention was never to touch gloves with Holland once again. But yeah, who knows? All I know is regardless of whatever happened, Chimaev was going to win that fight nonetheless. Especially when you consider the fact that Holland took this fight on a day's notice. I mean, did people really expect Kevin Holland to win this fight knowing that he was going to get dominated on the ground, which is exactly what happened. But moving on, the UFC now needs to realize that they need to put Khamzat Chimaev in there with a top contender for his next fight, regardless of the division he decides to compete going forward. If it's at middleweight, then there is just one fight that makes all the sense to me right now, and it's Paulo Costa versus Khamzat Chimaev. The two men got into an altercation leading up to UFC 279, and honestly, it would be a great test for Chimaev at 185 because Costa is obviously no joke. His striking is no joke, and it's his insane power that Chimaev needs to be careful of about all times if they're ever going to fight. Because we all saw what happened when Khamzat fought Gilbert Burns, who has massive power in his hands. Burns literally got the better of Chimaev during a few exchanges between them in that fight, so you could probably imagine what a Chimaev versus Costa fight would look like, especially if Khamzat isn't careful enough and decided to stand and trade with someone like Paulo Costa. But yeah, if you ask me though, if I think Khamzat Chimaev should stick to fight at 170 going forward, I mean, he has come so far in the welterweight division already. He's ranked at number 3. He beat a former title contender in the form of Gilbert Burns as well, and could literally be one win away from challenging for the welterweight championship, regardless of the weight miss for UFC 279. All he needs to do is be a little bit more professional and make weight going forward. And with that being said, who could Khamzat Chimaev's next opponent in the UFC be at 170? The obvious answer, and I'm sure some of you will agree with me on this, is Colby Covington. Covington is currently sitting at number 2 and Chimaev is sitting at number 3, so it automatically makes sense and it would be the perfect fight for Colby Covington to make his UFC return as well. And on top of that, you can throw in the added factor of him constantly taking shots at Chimaev over the last few months, in interviews and maybe during his press conferences as well. Yeah, so we've seen Colby Covington, label Khamzat Chimaev and call him terms as well. And a fight against Chimaev would also mean that it would be the first time in a while Colby will actually be fighting a fighter not named Kamaru Usman, and we can finally get to see a former interim welterweight champion share the octagon with a top welterweight contender. I mean, that is something that hasn't exactly happened in recent years, other than Colby's last win over Jorge Masvidal. After all, I mean, I'm sure most of you backed Covington to beat Masvidal at that point with ease, and honestly, if you ask me, that fight from UFC 272 feels like an afterthought at this point. So yeah, going forward, the perfect matchmaking decision would be to have Colby Covington and Khamzat Chimaev settle their beef inside the octagon. Now, Khamzat has insane wrestling, as we all know, and as it so happens, Colby Covington also happens to be one of the best wrestlers in the current 170-pound division. I mean, Covington has incredible wrestling, but the only issue, other than his second fight against Kamaru Usman, we haven't exactly seen what he's truly capable of as a wrestler when he shares the octagon with a fighter who is equally impressive when it comes to wrestling. So yeah, Covington did dominate Jorge Masvidal and Tyron Woodley with his wrestling, but let's be honest, they never really stood a chance in front of such elite level wrestling. And when it comes to Khamzat Chimaev, I think he sort of has had slight issues when he fought Gilbert Burns in terms of his wrestling as well, because Burns has such incredible takedown defense and his movement was causing all sort of troubles to Khamzat as well, even when he was trying to out grapple him. And throughout that fight, Khamzat was sort of rushing into things, and you could pretty much see that his corner kept warning him, trying to maintain his composure and not get hit by Burns, because there were stages when he was in real trouble to lose that fight. He got himself into some vulnerable positions. If that's the right term. But yeah, Khamzat Chimaev's wrestling is truly going to get tested by someone like Colby Covington and vice versa. Now, in terms of power, I think Covington doesn't really have the same attributes in terms of his power and strength when you compare him to Gilbert Burns. But yeah, who possibly Burns, of course, possibly has more strength in his hands, more power in his hands. So you wouldn't really think that Colby is going to test Chimaev's chin with his strength. Instead, if those two ever fought, I think it will be more of a wrestling slash grappling inspired fight from both men. I'm not completely denying Colby's striking. He is quite good in terms of his striking, in terms of his combinations, and the timing of his strikes are quite good as well. But then again, would Colby Covington actually stand there and risk a striking battle with someone like Khamzat Chimaev? I don't think so. But nonetheless, Covington versus Chimaev is definitely the fight to make at welterweight. It is a very, very intriguing fight, and honestly, if you ask me, I just want to see those two share the octagon because we truly deserve to see the absolute best version of Khamzat Chimaev after his fight against Gilbert Burns. And honestly, the same could be said for Colby Covington as well, isn't it? How good can he be when he shares the octagon with a legitimate threat at 170? Honestly, for Covington, it's either Khamzat Chimaev or Gilbert Burns next for his next fight, for his return fight after all the troubles that he had recently with the Jorge Masvidal drama, outside of the UFC. But yeah, moving on, the other option for Khamzat Chimaev at 170 is the loser of Leon Edwards versus Kamaru Usman 2. So yeah, it's almost guaranteed that the rematch between those two men is happening next, especially after Chimaev missed weight. So we now know that he isn't getting the next title shot. So Chimaev could face either someone like Leon Edwards or Kamaru Usman, both of which are quite exciting fights in my opinion, to say the least. But personally, for me, I would say that Usman versus Chimaev is the more intriguing fight because, as some people like to believe, Usman and Covington are considered as the mirror images of each other in the welterweight division because their fighting styles are sort of similar to an extent, to be honest. And the only difference I can possibly outline between them is that Usman is much more of a dangerous striker and he has incredible power in his hands. So you would naturally think that he could end up being a huge threat to Khamzat Chimaev if they were fought. If Usman somehow ends up losing once again to Leon, then fighting Khamzat Chimaev and beating him would be the perfect way for the Nigerian Nightmare to bounce back and make everyone realize that he is still a threat in the 170-pound division. Either way, Usman versus Chimaev is going to happen if Chimaev goes on to be a top contender at 170 next and Usman somehow regains the welterweight championship. But the idea of Usman versus Chimaev as a potential title eliminator fight is also quite exciting, to be honest, because that way it allows us to possibly witness another fresh welterweight matchup between Colby Covington and Gilbert Burns, which is also a very exciting fight. So you sort of have like a mini welterweight tournament with four top guys in the division. However, the only issue with Usman versus Chimaev is that Chimaev has to wait a while before he can get back to fighting, because obviously, before that fight gets booked, to be honest, because obviously Usman simply isn't going to fight Khamzat 1 month after possibly losing to Edwards in the rematch, which I think will take place sometime later down the road this year itself, maybe in the UK. Now, lastly, we have Khamzat Chimaev versus Leon Edwards if Kamaru Usman goes on to regain the welterweight championship. And while this isn't exactly as intriguing as the other two fights, that is Usman versus Chimaev and Colby Covington versus Chimaev, the Edwards versus Chimaev fight itself should be quite fun, even though Edwards has to work a lot on his takedown defense and his grappling to survive the Khamzat Chimaev wrestling onslaught. This fight was, of course, originally booked 2 years ago, and honestly, back then, this was absolutely perfect. You had the rising star in the form of Khamzat Chimaev, who many people wanted to see get tested against a top name like Leon Edwards, so that was like the perfect matchmaking at that point. So it would have been Khamzat's make or break fight like 2 years ago. But now, it's sort of predictable, almost to an extent, how Chimaev versus Edwards how the Chimaev versus Edwards fight will end, and I'm not quite sure if I want to see that fight because honestly, we saw at the end of the day how much Leon Edwards struggled against Kamaru Usman, how he struggled to neutralize Usman's wrestling throughout the first 4 rounds of their fight, maybe in the fifth round as well, until he connected that head kick that knocked out Usman. But yeah, regardless though, if you ask me, all I want to see right now is Khamzat Chimaev fight another top name at the in the welterweight division, maybe even at middleweight, who knows. At welterweight, like I said, the obvious options for Khamzat Chimaev is Colby Covington or Kamaru Usman. At middleweight, the perfect option right now is, in terms of recent turn of events, is Paulo Costa. All three fighters are capable of pushing Chimaev to his limit, and Paulo Costa also has one fight left on his UFC contract, so why not just give Paulo Costa the perfect farewell fight, or like the send-off fight, if he is willing to test free agency next after his contract expires against Khamzat Chimaev himself, just so those two can settle their beef. Because I think Paulo Costa is way more capable of testing Khamzat Chimaev and taking him to deep waters. I know his wrestling credential or his grappling credentials aren't the best, but his striking is super, super explosive. And Khamzat Chimaev is also an explosive striker, but Paulo Costa has the strength advantage, I would say. He definitely has the size advantage over someone like Khamzat Chimaev, but he also could have the strength advantage. So he definitely has the knockout power. So yeah, maybe we could see Khamzat Chimaev in trouble against Paulo Costa unless he doesn't decide to fight smart. But yeah, why not put one of your best fighters in the form of Chimaev against the best the UFC has to offer right now? Why not just put him against Colby Covington? Because that's the fight, honestly, I would love to see. If not Chimaev versus Usman. But yeah, for now, after UFC 217, after the way Khamzat Chimaev absolutely dismantled Kevin Holland in that first round, I desperately want to see him fight another top name in the welterweight division, because we all deserve to see the best version of Khamzat Chimaev instead of like having him, compete in fights like these that we saw. No disrespect to Kevin Holland at all, but yeah, we all knew how that fight was going to end. So yeah, like I said, either give us Chimaev versus Colby Covington or Chimaev versus Kamaru Usman if he somehow doesn't beat Leon Edwards. But yeah, that's it for this video. If you guys enjoyed it, do drop a like, hit that like button. If you guys didn't enjoy it, you feel free to hit that dislike button as well. If you guys enjoy the content, if you guys enjoy the live streams, hit that subscribe button. I would really, really appreciate it. But yeah, that's it for this video. I will see you guys in the next video. I'll see you guys in the next live stream. Thanks for watching, everyone. Peace.